Disaster Trio.
Hi.
Hola.
Cześć.
Welcome to the second episode of the Disaster Trio podcast. My name is Francisco, and this episode was written by Natalia Florek. Today, I will tell you about one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Ammonium nitrate is the main character in this story, a compound whose explosive properties have already caused many disasters around the world. Quite recently, in fact, on August 4th, 2020, the world again has learned how dangerous the substance is. You might have heard about the Beirut explosion. Almost 3 tons of ammonium nitrate is stored in the harbor caused the explosion, which was heard several hundred kilometers away. 190 people were killed, and several thousand lost their houses, proving that in the 21st century, improper storage of hazardous substances is still a problem. More than 70 years before, in 1947, the same puffs of orange smoke were rising over the Texas City harbor. Are these stories similar? We'll see when we get to know the causes of the Beirut disaster. Texas City is located in the Gulf of Mexico, approximately 10 miles north of Galveston. In the 1940s, there were 10 refineries and a styrene production plant, which were the workplace of a large part of the city's inhabitants. There is a deep-sea inland port in Texas City and a very good rail connection to Houston and Galveston, which made the city a great transport hub for transshipment of goods between land and water. In 1947 alone, the port handled 2,661 ships and 10.4 million tons of crude oil. In 1946, the port obtained the necessary permits and from then on could handle ammonia fertilizers. Ammonium nitrate is a substance which, when heated, rapidly decomposes into nitric oxide and water, leading to an explosion. This was the reaction that occurred on April 16, 1947, on board the Grand Camp ship. In 1947, Europe still remembered the Second World War. The continent was still recovering, and that is why resources were shipped from overseas. The French ship Grand Camp arrived in Texas to be loaded with U.S. goods. When the port workers came to work on April 16th, there were already 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate on board. In addition, there was also sisal twines, peanuts, cotton, tobacco, drilling equipment, and several boxes of small ammunition. The workers went down to the hold and waited for the fertilizer pallets. They were smoking while waiting though, despite the fact that ammonium nitrate is a substance that explodes violently when heated. However, according to many sources, the employees either didn't respect smoking prohibition or didn't know it existed at all, as the warning signs were written in French. The bags themselves did not contain any information about the substance inside. Employees thought that the substance being transported had a similar degree of harmfulness to cement, which they had encountered many times before. The bags were made of paper, often torn because the paper was too thin. The Interstate Commerce Commission had yet to set a standard for bags meant for storage of hazardous substances, so the factories in Iowa and Nebraska that delivered ammonium nitrate to the port didn't want to deal with the cost of using stronger packaging materials. Further loading started. At 8:20 a.m., when the ship was already carrying 4,882 tons of ammonium nitrate on the fourth deck and 1,459 tons on the second deck, the workers smelled smoke. At first, there was little concern about the fire, and the employees picked up the 2 available fire extinguishers. The fire hose was also unfolded, but it turned out to be useless because for unknown reasons it was not possible to pump water into it, even though the pump was working properly. At the moment, it seemed that this should suffice and the fire would be stopped, but after a few moments, flames also appeared on the deck. The captain did not want to extinguish it with water though, as it would damage the cargo the ship was supposed to carry. So he gave the order to close the hatches to the hold. The fans were turned off, covered with wet rugs, and the steam system turned on. This was intended to nip the fire in the bud. However, the blankets covering the fans, after a while dried up, began to wave, which tore them apart. The captain also sent 7 people to the deck, 5 to remove the previously loaded ammunition from the ship. Carrying out these orders probably saved the lives of these workers. Despite attempts to extinguish the fire, the temperature in the hold continued to rise, and it was decided to withdraw the crew. A fire brigade was called, but at the time there was only a volunteer fire brigade in Texas City, employing 29 firefighters, although other sources say 24, and only 4 cars. In addition, some sources report that the telephone operators were on a strike at the time, which made it difficult to call for help. Eventually, a fireboat appeared on the scene. At about 8:30 a.m., the steam pressure in the hold floor blasted the hatch covers, and a stream of orange smoke rose into the sky. It looked quite phenomenal, so it was not surprising that a large group of onlookers had gathered in the port. All fire brigades also reached the port, and extinguishing action began. Unfortunately, the temperature was too high, and the water evaporated before it could reach the flames. At 9 o'clock, in addition to orange smoke, fire also started out of the hatch. On April 16, 1947, the residents of Texas City and the surrounding area saw a mushroom cloud that was over 600 meters long, which was caused by the ammonium nitrate explosion on the Grand Camp ship. The explosion was heard 240 kilometers away, and the shock wave was so large that it knocked down 2 planes from the sky and triggered a tsunami 4.5 meters high. People in the streets were knocked over, and the windows all over the city were shattered. Buildings 24 kilometers from the harbor were shaken, and the firefighters in the vicinity of the ship, crew members, and port workers, as well as onlookers, lost their lives. Even if someone survived the first blast, the tsunami caused all of the bodies to be sucked into the water, leaving no chance for survival. Ship's fragments wreaked havoc in the port. The burning balls of cotton and sisal sparked additional fires everywhere. Ship debris damaged pipelines at a nearby refinery, causing an oil spill and a subsequent fire. The fire also occurred at the nearby Monsanto chemical plant, causing a series of small and large explosions that killed 145 workers. As a result of the explosion, around 600 people lost their lives, and 3,000 to 4,000 people were injured, although the numbers do vary depending on the source. Texas City bursted into flames. Despite the chaos, the residents tried to help the wounded on their own. People turned from the freeway, seeing the glow of the fire and the orange smoke coming from the explosion behind them. In nearby Galveston, where the blast was felt, medical units rushed to the rescue without waiting for a call. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the Texas City explosions. At the time, there was still another ship in the port called the High Flyer. She had been there for some time, as one of the engines was being serviced. On April 16th, the ship was being loaded. However, this loading was interrupted due to the explosion at Grand Camp. The crew was evacuated, but before leaving the ship, it was decided to tightly close the hatches to the hold and additionally cover them with wet tarpaulins to secure the goods stored on the ship, which were sulfur, 445 tons of flour, and about 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, the same substance that had caused the catastrophe a few hours earlier. The force of the explosion tore the lines of the High Flyer and caused a collision with another ship, which resulted in serious damage but she did not sink. An hour after the explosion, there was no living soul on board, and it was only in the afternoon that the team searching for victims decided to search the deck of the high flyer. No injured men and no corpses were found on the ship, but flames were coming from one of the holds. This was immediately reported to the port authorities, but those, having the entire rescue operation on their minds, ignored the problem, and only around 11 p.m., tugs were sent there to pull the ship away from the port. The anchor chains had been severed, but the tugs were still too weak to pull the ship out. Around 1 a.m. on April 17th, the members of the crew designated to tow the ship noticed flames bursting from the hold. People who had learned from the experience of the Grand Camp fled in fear of another explosion, and unfortunately they were quite right to do so. At 1:10 a.m., there was an explosion of 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate stored on the high flyers. The explosion was more powerful than the one on the Grand Camp ship, but fortunately the city was already mobilized. People had been evacuated from the port area earlier, so the second explosion did not increase the death toll. Unfortunately, though, all the effort put into fighting the fire in Texas City was wasted. The second explosion caused further fires in the refineries, and the oil tanks were also unsealed, which literally added oil to the fire. The city was set on fire again, although the previous fires have not been extinguished yet. Rescue teams did what they could to save the city. Unfortunately, more than one-third of the apartments were destroyed and 2,500 people were left homeless. No building in Texas City had windows. The firefighters worked almost non-stop, but nevertheless, most of the fires just burned out by themselves. The city's losses were later estimated at $50 to $75 million. How could such a catastrophe happen? After all, ammonium nitrate has been used in the agricultural industry for years, and its storage and transport have never caused such a great disasters before. As usual, there is no single cause that led to the tragedy. The first aspect to look at is the historical context of this incident. In 1947, the effects of the barely finished war were felt all over the world, in the US as well. There was no job, so people caught up to all kinds of activities. Specialists were not hired, and employees did not receive training in safety. Moreover, even if the employees were able to identify the threats, the fear of losing their jobs prevented them from reporting any irregularities. And thus, port workers and the ship's crew allowed themselves to load torn sacks with ammonium nitrate and store them in large amounts. There was also a lack of work discipline. The people who loaded the ship smoked there during the breaks, which was prohibited by law, but not respected by anyone, and its compliance was not checked either. Other warnings were written in French, and therefore incomprehensible to the employees. It should also be emphasized that perhaps the workers themselves would quit the idea of smoke in the hold if they knew the substance they were dealing with. Another reason for the catastrophe was therefore ignorance. The bags were not marked in any way with symbols that might indicate their explosive contents. There were no warnings on them or information about their contents either. This is a totally unacceptable situation nowadays. All products with a harmful effect must have pictograms that clearly illustrate the properties of their content to anybody handling them. Not only the workers carrying the bags did not know how to deal with ammonium nitrate, but the port management and the ship's command did not know how to deal with it either. This is evidenced by the method of conducting the firefighting operation. Closing the hatches and trying to suppress the fire had exactly the opposite effects. In the hold, the vapor pressure increased and, following the ideal gas law, the temperature rose significantly, which accelerated the decomposition of ammonium nitrate into nitrogen oxide and water. Since the decomposition reaction itself releases heat, it accelerates the decomposition of surrounding material, leading to an explosive chain reaction. Water extinguishing, although it would destroy the contents of the ship, would probably have stopped the fire. The guards called to the site attempted to extinguish with water, in fact. Perhaps the fire could still be extinguished at this point, but the number of firefighters and the equipment they had at their disposal was insufficient. And remember that all Texas City fire services were on hand. One of the causes of the disasters can also be found here. In this city, where the port has received permits to handle hazardous substances, only 29 firefighters with 4 fire trucks were available. Not much, considering that the city also had refineries and a chemical plant. There was also no strong leadership, so the rescue operation was carried out in a chaotic manner, which resulted in a second explosion. It would seem that the world would have learned a bitter lesson, and the same mistakes would not be repeated. Yet, this year, in 2020, ammonium nitrate added another chapter in the history of its disasters. Although I suppose the bags were properly labeled, the workers were trained in how to handle them, and safe extinguishing methods were known, there was a major explosion in Beirut, in Lebanon. Does this mean that people have learned nothing? Such a statement would be unfair, though. In Beirut, the substance was stored in a ship which, due to technicalities, was stuck in the port. As it was realized how dangerous the cargo being transported was, it was decided to move it from the ship to the port warehouse. The need to remove ammonium nitrate from its storage had been repeatedly reported, and, for unknown reasons, no one ever took care of it. This neglect, similarly to the one in Texas, led to the explosion. We still have to wait for a complete analysis of the causes of the disasters in Beirut, though. Stories like this remind us that dangerous substances, when stored in large quantities, are a huge threat. Only strict adherence to storage guidelines can prevent a disaster. I record this episode from my home, hoping that there will never be any negligence again, and will remind the world of how dangerous ammonium nitrate can be. All the best from me and my colleagues from the Disaster Trio. I was your host, Francisco. This script was written by Natalia Florek, and the episode was edited by Marta Brocka. Remember to wash your hands, be careful with ammonium nitrate, and take care of your loved ones.